Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is my 2016 goal overview and reading overview. So in 2016 I read 108 books. I had set myself a challenge on Goodreads to read 100, so I passed that. By comparison, in 2014 I read 74, so that was an increase in that, an even bigger increase in pages, because this year's number of pages according to Goodreads was 27,660. Versus last year it was 16,423. Now in both of these I don't count rereads, so it's not really a pure reading number. It's still a big jump, which is because of one of the other goals that I set, which, looking at my 2015 list, I found that almost 3/4, literally 74% of what I read in 2015 had been sequential art, so graphic novels and graphic memoirs and comics based. My goal had been to balance that out to try to be maybe 50-50. And so to compare, in 2015, I read 23% prose, 1% poetry, and 74% sequential art. And in 2016, it was 65% prose, 30% sequential art, and about 2% poetry, and a little over 2% mixed type. So that was what I was counting. And anything that included a combination of things. One of the last books that I read in 2016 was Linwood Barclay's humor book, Mike Harris Made Me Eat My Dog, which is a very sort of mixed media style because it has essay style pieces, list style pieces, dialogue written screenplay style. It has political cartoons in there, so that I was counting as mixed. So that was pretty successful. Other difference, and this wasn't particularly intentional, but specifically in 2015 I had been at about 90% fiction to just under 10% nonfiction, whereas this year it was 80 and 20%. So that changed a little bit as well, which wasn't part of a goal because I think I've had some years where it was the other way. But that was interesting. The thing that I see a lot of people doing is the best and worst, or favorites and disappointments list. And this was tricky for me because I went, well, obviously the best thing I read this year was The Hungry Ghosts by Shyam Selvadurai. And then I looked at my Goodreads list and went, no, I actually read that in 2015. And then I thought, well, maybe it was Kicking the Sky by Anthony Desai, and I also read that in 2015. So clearly this year didn't have a lot of books that jumped out at me as being absolute favorites, but I definitely do have a few to talk about. I've talked about this book in a couple of videos already, but I think the most meaningful thing that I read this year was Chast's graphic memoir, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, which is about her life as her parents were declining in their old age, which really had a big impact on me in terms of perspective, and is why I was in Toronto for 3.5 months. I'm back in my own house back in Texas. I'm no longer in Toronto. It's so much warmer here. It's like 20 degrees Celsius. Which is, I don't know, it's in the 80s Fahrenheit, whereas back in Toronto it's 0, which is 32 Fahrenheit. So, yes, no snow. Anyway, that has nothing to do with this. Except that this is the book that made me feel that I should go and stay with my mother when she was having a hip replacement. Made me appreciate family more. And well, that sounds cheesy, but it's genuinely true. This book, which is also a good read and has a really interesting art style, and is definitely worth reading on its own. It has a lot of mixed media, you've got photos and everything in there. So it's definitely interesting artistically as well, but in terms of personal impact, that had a big personal impact. In terms of pure emotional reaction, I'm gonna say Robin Hobb's Fool's Assassin, which I read earlier this year, and I think I talked about this in a wrap-up before. But yeah, you don't see a huge amount of quest fantasy that starts out with the style of story that this started out with, and I found it extremely emotionally engaging. And this is the kind of plot-driven story where I don't want to spoil too much, but I did end up giving this 5 stars, and I don't know if I should have, because I think that was primarily because I was emotionally engaged in it, whereas I don't know that it's actually great writing, but yeah. In terms of, one of the things that I usually read a lot of are First World War memoirs, and I reread, sort of, Storm of Steel this year. When I had read this before, it was an older translation. And I think this must be a lot better because I really don't remember much from having read it before. So it's Michael Hoffman's translation, which came out in 2003. And if you have not read this version and you are wanting to read this in English, yeah, pick this up. I also have a few books that I thought were fantastic, but that I don't really mention as favorites on their own because they're from continuing series. So one that came out was volume 14 of Takehiko Inoue's Real, which is sports manga. It's a wheelchair basketball drama. It interweaves sports stories with life stories. It is volume 14, so this is not new. The series is not new for the year, although this translation just came out this year. And if you have not picked it up, this volume is just as good as the rest of the series. I would be hesitant to put this on a favorites list just because it is part of a series and you have to read the whole thing. But yeah, it's fantastic. And I feel like even if you don't traditionally like sports manga, it might be worth checking this out anyway because it is a little bit more serious than a lot of the sports comics that one sees, and it's aimed at a somewhat older audience. I wouldn't say exclusively an adult audience, but definitely an older teenage audience, and it is less juvenile than Slam Dunk, which is by the same author, which I think has turned some people off of this, because this is really a fantastic series. Finally, this is actually a volume 1, Steve Orlando's Midnighter, which this particular collection came out this year, but the individual issues were out last year. So again, I feel odd calling it a favorite of the year because I read it as it was coming out in the issues last year. But this volume came out, and while this series ended, there is a new Midnighter and Apollo series that is also by Steve Orlando, which is ongoing. I believe there are 3 more issues left in the current miniseries. And yeah, it's fantastic. I feel like so much of the DC's recent reboots has been disappointing, but this is the one book that I cannot complain very much about. It's really fantastic. And as an old Wildstorm fan, I like to see Wildstorm characters. In terms of best, one of the last things I read this year was Joseph Boyden's Wenjack, which is based on a depressing true story about an Ojibwe boy who ran away from a residential school in the 60s. It's definitely a moving story. It is a timely political story in, coming after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there have definitely been a lot of Aboriginal and more specifically First Nations issues in the media this year, so there's more of a, at least in Canada, so it's definitely timely in that sense. It has a really interesting writing style where the point of view alternates between the boy and the animals who are the sort of the forest spirits inhabiting animals who are watching him. So you get 2 very different styles going back and forth in between chapters. There's also some nice illustrations in between of the different animals, or of different animals as they have their short, meaningful, and I wouldn't necessarily call this my favorite book of the year, but I think it was definitely probably the best book that I read this year. And it's short, so if you haven't read it, no excuse not to. And a portion of the proceeds go to charities. In terms of disappointments, one of the last books that I read this year was genuinely disappointing and not good. And that was Charles Todd's The Walnut Tree. Is sold as having mystery elements, and the mystery elements were not there. Were barely a tertiary plot point. Turned out to be a cheesy love triangle, and with cheesy ideas about class and the typical kind of cheesy story about, oh, isn't this rich high-class lady suffering from being a rich high-class lady? No, I don't think she is. And then it got worse. I got about halfway through the book and I said to my mother, because this was actually a book I had given her, I think maybe a birthday gift or something, because we both read a lot of Charles Todd's mysteries, and I thought, well, this will be good, not knowing anything about it. And I was halfway through and I commented to my mother that I wasn't enjoying it. She's like, you're really not going to enjoy it when you get to the end. And she was right, because it ended up going for one of, let's call it the me before you trope for ending the love triangle. That was, I might do a video complaining about this book because I really was horrified that it ended the way it did, especially given that so many of the Charles Todd mystery books deal with similar social issues in better ways. And so I read this thinking, this is a pair, and it's a writing team, so this is a pair of people who have dealt with similar issues in fantastic ways before, and then they wrote this, and it was awful, both from a writing perspective, because it was cheesy. It wasn't engaging. So it was bad and it was offensive. And this is a pair of authors who can do better. And I think there are some authors where you know going in, you're not going to expect great prose, or you're not going to expect sensitive storylines, but if they engage in some kind of topic that you like, you might read them and love them anyway. And I know I feel that way about a lot of like political thrillers. There are some authors that I really enjoy who are not great writers, and I know they're not great writers, so I don't go in expecting that, but this is a pair who generally do good solid work and who generally engage in certain issues in fairly sensitive and realistic ways. And this book had neither of those things. It was bad and it was offensive. So yeah, that was definitely my most disappointing book of the year. And anyway, that was my 2016. Normally this is the point where I'd say, now I'm gonna go watch everybody else's videos, but I think everybody else has done their videos and I'm just behind on this. Yeah, it was a good year for books. So hopefully next year will be as good for books. And that's it. Ciao.